where my good friend Ruby Katz and I, Catherine Thornwood, talk about everything related to books, world building, ideas, writing, inspiration, fandom, kind of anything that strikes our fancy. So I am Catherine Thornwood. You can find me at my blog, catherinethornwood.com, and I am a fantasy writer.
And I am R Katz, also known as Ruby Katz, and you can find me at rkatzbooks.com. You can also find me on Instagram and on TikTok at author R Katz. And I primarily write contemporary novels, mostly sports novels, but I'm starting to branch out into other genres as well. And I have one historical novel out.
We'll get you into fantasy yet.
That's going to take a lot because somehow my brain does not function well with fantasy. I start, and this is part of the reason we're talking about this is kind of going to go into today's topic. I start the writing it, and then about 2-3 chapters in, I start to stall because I can't figure out what in the world I'm going to be writing. How do I create the magic process? How do I create the world that we're doing? And I just move on to something contemporary because it's easier for me.
So, what is it that we are going to talk about today, you might ask? We are going to talk about ideas and inspiration, specifically a little bit about how Ruby and I both come at our inspiration, come at our ideas, how, for instance, we cultivate them, how do we make that garden grow? And one of our controversial opinions is that ideas are cheap and inspiration is priceless.
It definitely is. And this is where it's, especially if you've been reading a lot of novels, and I'll have read a lot of romance novels over last year. I think I read like 351. And it's one of those where if you're looking at the ideas, you're going to see a lot of similar tropes or a lot of similar themes in stories. And that's not saying that somebody is copying you, but it's they work together because they work so well together. And I know that probably sounds a little bit weird when you're hearing me say it, but it's something like think about a story you've read where it's the enemies to lovers, people who absolutely despise each other, but they're put into a situation where they have to pretend to date. And oh, that is so glorious to read. And there's probably about at least 50% of the stories I read last year had that similar theme because they work so well together.
That's actually a very, very good place to start. We've talked about in previous podcasts that there have not been original ideas in this world made by humans since we were around campfires making up myths and trying to figure out why exactly the sun was always in the same position in the sky when it was time to plant for harvest. So, what that means is that the thing that turns the seed of an idea into something that is worth cultivating is the cultivation itself. So you take, let's say a little sesame seed. That sesame seed, yeah, you can eat it and it's going to maybe give you like a tenth of a calorie worth of sustenance. But what you'd actually probably want to do with that seed is you'd want to plant it in the ground and let it grow its roots and let it flower and then bear fruit. And that's a lot of what writing actually is it's not the generation of ideas as much as ChatGPT wants us to believe that. It's actually the cultivation of them that is what the process of writing actually is for us. So, go ahead.
And I think that that's a big part of it because I know AI is here. AI is a large part of our world. And there are so many people I know who will go to AI and say, or go to ChatGPT and say, give me a premise, give me an idea for a novel. And ChatGPT will say, give me a story about a childhood friends where he's the best friend's brother and they meet later in life and realize that they're attracted to each other. Okay, you can work with that. But it's how you create the story based off of that one prompt that really determines who's the good storyteller versus who is a good translator. I guess that's the best way to put it.
I'm just also going to say that I am a complete anti large language model ChatGPT Luddite. So, the way I get my inspiration when I need premises actually is never going to ChatGPT, mostly
I
because I
only
don't like the I don't like the environmental impact of ChatGPT. I don't like the way that it's basically stolen and trained on all of the internet. I don't like their practices. And personally, I don't like the fact that my electricity bill has gone up because they have data centers all over the place. And, I'm sorry, but like I did not opt into paying for that. Sorry for the side rant.
Coming up with the idea in and of itself is going to be part and parcel of what we're talking about in today's podcast. Where do you get your inspiration? And how do you then develop the story after you've been inspired?
Right. So, um, one of the things that I know I do, because I am, you know, the inattentive type of ADHD, and if you ask, yes, lots and lots of your favorite authors are neurodivergent in wonderful, beautiful ways. Is I make sure I have something to write my ideas down wherever I go because I never am quite sure what sort of cockamamie off the wall thing that I woke up from a dream from is actually going to end up taking root in my mind and becoming the story that I want to write. Um, I think one of the examples of this is just sort of scrolling Reddit. I saw an article about 1960s BBC. There were actually pirate ships out on the coast of Great Britain broadcasting rock and roll, which is the coolest premise I think I have ever heard. And it just like lodged itself in my brain. And I knew it was something I had to figure out it was something that I needed to figure out a story to write about. So you never know when that kind of random story is going to hit you. Making sure you have a way to record it so that you can go back to it is really important. And I suspect that, you know, pirate ship out broadcasting rock and roll would maybe not be something that ChatGPT would be able to give me
No.
compared to, again, just randomly being on the internet somewhere.
Like I've written stories based off of Twitter feeds that I've seen where somebody was like talking about something that happened to them. And I went, that's a really cute, meet cute story. Let me do a short story based off of that. I've written stories that were inspired by songs just because like something in the lyrics spoke to me. And then this world started building and creating in my head. And then it's also sometimes you write stories based off of your own experiences, people that you know, people that you've spoken with, your own life experiences, your own life journey. I mean, I was just speaking with the president of my local romance writers chapter, and she was saying that a lot of her stories are the second chance she never had with somebody. And so I'm like, that actually makes a lot of sense that a lot of writers will use their own path, use the people that they know as that inspiration.
I definitely use my day job, which is astronomy, for a lot of my inspiration. Um, I like to think about how very specific physics things are actually going to play into making magic. So for me, a lot of times, like my world building will come from, I actually kind of wonder what dark energy would do if I just added it in as the magic system I want.
So if I ever set a book in space, I'm definitely calling you and be like, "Hey, Kat, talk to me
Oh,
about this because I'm a little bit lost."
I already want to do a cannonball run story in space. Like that is something that is in my brain for the future. So like we're here for that. Download a map of the Milky Way and make sure you know exactly where Earth is on it, because that's a really good place to start.
I'm just blinking at you because this is so not my world. Because in my day job, I'm an attorney, she's the scientist, and it works because we're so very different.
It really does. That's actually what tends to be very, very fun. One of the things, if you're thinking about how you're going to find your own inspiration, speaking to somebody who does not think or behave the same way you do is such a great way to get inspiration and to pick up topics that you were not thinking about. It's a case where, probably one of the, when Ruby has to explain a law thing to me because I'm just very confused, I'm guessing that there are stories that can come out of it for her. And I know that, when I'm sort of sitting down and going, like, well, gravity on Mars is not going to quite do the thing that you want it to do. I'm probably thinking about how I would colonize Mars if I were to do it.
But that's also like this is where we're talking about like we each see the world differently, and I think part of that is because of our educational background and because of the experiences that we have, but also like Kat talked about in the beginning where she's neurodivergent. I'm also neurodivergent as well, but we have a different way of approaching things, and it each affects us differently. And so we can have the same prompt, because I've gone to her and said, "Hey, I've got this prompt that I need help with. I'm working on this story. I don't know what to do. Help." And the stories that we came up with were very, very different because our brains work differently.
Exactly. So, that means that you're probably going to need to think about how you're gonna grow the garden once you have that idea, and how I know for me, like, some of it is actually just, like, I get touched with I'd call it divine inspiration, but that's not what it is at all. It is literally my brain will not let go of some concept that I heard or some idea I had until I actually sit down and I think about how I'm actually going to plant that seed and grow that plant and watch it flower. So, for different people, it's going to be different. As I said, for me, it's literally a case where the hyperfixation kicks in and I just wanna sit down and write that idea. The one that hit me recently is exactly the BBC radio story that I was talking about, and I'm turning it into a steampunk world, because what could be cooler than pirate ships in a steampunk world playing rock and roll to a suppressed society?
I mean, it sounds awesome, but to me. And so the inspiration can really come from anywhere. It can come from stories that you read. You can read a story, you can look at it, and you can say, okay, I wish this one element was different. I wish they had taken it in this other direction. And in the fandom, that Kat and I write in, you'll get people who will give you comments and say, "Well, I really wish you had done this instead. I really wish you had done that. I really thought this character was supposed to look like this. Why did you make this character look like that?" And the author's response is usually, "Okay, well, if you want it that way, then write it yourself." And that's where you see actually a lot of people do get their inspiration for the books and the stories that they write. You'll see, like right now, if I go onto Instagram and I go and I scroll through, I will find so many advertisements. There'll be something like Breaking Bad meets CSI Miami or Fourth Wing in Space, inspired by A Court of Thorn and Roses, where people will take and see stories that have been written by other people and go, "Ooh, I want to write a dragon shifter story. I want to write this kind of a story." And they're inspired by that story because that's what gave them the, "Hey, I want to create my own world in this." But that is very different versus a retelling and plagiarism, which is another part that we're going to be talking about in today's podcast. Because the difference between a retelling is like, I have a Sense and Sensibility adaptation out there where I've taken the story of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, and yes, I promise I can talk. Um, and I've edited it because I wanted to see a story where Marianne chose Brandon as opposed to falling for and pining over Willoughby, because thought you got to see so much more growth with her if she'd made a different choice. So I wrote it. But that's a retelling of a story that's already been created. And that one's in the public domain, so it's fine. But if you're going to say, like, I took A Court of Thorn and Roses and I'm going to retell it, that's not quite as okay because it's a current book that is still under copyright protection. But if you sit there and say, I want to make a story that focuses on dragon riders or dragon shifters, but I'm going to make a completely different world about it, but it's inspired by A Court of Thorn and Roses, then you're fine. Actually, I think that's Fourth Wing, not Court of Thorn and Roses. But then it's also with the plagiarism. Are you taking somebody else's words and just changing out the character that is in it? So instead of a gentleman with black hair and blue eyes, are you making it a gentleman with blonde hair and green eyes? Is it now a woman who has blonde hair with blue eyes becomes a woman with red hair and hazel eyes? And you change the character names, but you've kept everything else the same. You're just plagiarizing the story.
Exactly. And they're basically, for plagiarism versus inspiration, it's often a case of volume. So, for one thing, I know of a pretty recent case where there were 2 books that were incredibly, incredibly similar, and when people went in and looked at the plot points, they found that plot points were kind of beat for beat the same as the plot points in one of the other books. I'm not going to name the books because I don't want to call out the people, and I'll just say that there are multiple cases of this happening recently. So basically, if you're taking an idea, I want to write about a demon who's trapped in a mirror because I saw it in this other book. That is not plagiarism. That is inspiration to some degree. And the second you start to write that book yourself, not looking and not trying to, for instance, recreate the plot points of the original book that that idea came from, you're not plagiarizing. Um, at the same time, let's say you do want to do a retelling of a book that is not in the public domain. You actually can still do that perfectly acceptably on Archive of Our Own, something like that, where you do it for fan fiction and you do it via fair use, which means you're not profiting off of it. So you can write a beat for beat plot points of A Court of Thorns and Roses, but let's say that you actually wanted it to be in the Naruto fandom. That is also okay because, again, you are not materially costing that author anything. It still is probably in poor taste, especially if you're doing it really, truly beat for beat. And people will probably plug their nose if they find and can see that you have done that. But again, in that case, you are not doing something that is going to get you sued.
And that is one of the things where we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about this in another podcast as well about the difference between public domain versus non public domain. If you want to take the works of Jane Austen and recreate them or add an image into it and resell it in the entirety, that's fine because it's in the public domain. So I'm not going to go too much into that because, again, we're going to use that as a separate, as another topic entirely. But it's also knowing where your book is into if you're going to be doing a retelling of it. Or if you're going to be essentially doing a retelling of I got very inspired by Nora Roberts' The Bride Quartet. So I want to create a story about four women who create their own wedding industry. That's an inspiration. And if I go in and if I write very similar stories but different worlds, I'm still inspired by it. Now if I go back and say, okay, her first book in it is The Photographer. So let me make my first book The Photographer. The second book is going to be The Florist. The third book is going to be the baker. Now the fourth book is going to be the person who acts as the bridal consultant. Well, now I'm basically copying that from Nora Roberts, and so that goes more along the lines of you're going into the type of potentially plagiarism.
So, again, if that is something that you want, for instance, let's say you just, again, really love Nora Roberts, but want her to be, want that particular book to be written with your favorite characters, you can do that. Someone will probably notice that and be like, oh, this is exactly the same as this other thing.
I promise I won't
And
do that to anybody else.
um, but it's a case where if you try to take that and you try to turn it into something that is for profit, and it doesn't matter if you obfuscate or not, if you say, "Oh yes, this is really heavily inspired by X and I'm going to try to sell it anyway," and people read X and are like, "This is plot point for plot point the same book," you're probably going to put yourself into like some legal worries. But again, this is one of those places where part of the way to think about how you're going to cultivate that story into something is thinking about how much effort you're putting into it. Part of the reason we're talking about plot point by plot point copying is it means that you yourself are not actually doing a ton of work to make a world and a story your own. You're taking somebody else's thing and you're not putting that effort in. So you're basically just, planting the seed in dry soil and forgetting to water it.
And then part of that will then, like, Kat had spoken about her inspiration with the BBC. So that really comes down to where do we get inspired by? Because inspiration can really be anywhere. And this is where we were talking about where if you're reading a book and you say, I want to write another story in a similar world, go ahead and write it. If you're listening to a song, like if I listen to the song Someone Like You by Adele, I actually have a story that I want to create for it based off of a woman who's trying to get her second chance only to find out that the guy has moved on. And so she finally then accepts another guy who's been interested in her because she's realized that that moment's passed. But it's
Well, it's
like everybody has different things that that inspire them.
and every everybody has different things that inspire them, and everybody can be inspired by so many different things. We can be inspired by, again, reading the most random article on, the history of radio. We can be inspired by walking along, like, the Chesapeake Bay for me, and just smelling the salt air and thinking of something from that. We can be inspired by the weirdest dream that we've ever had that woke us up in the middle of the night. And we can be inspired by, for instance, reading a book we found awful and decided that we could probably do it better. And yes, there are definitely books out there that you can tell are written from a place of spite
There
and
definitely
fan
are.
fiction.
Yes, and there are some where, like, if you're reading a story, like, there's one that I've read that was based off of Pompeii, and I will be, like, a flat out honest, I am a giant Pompeii geek. Like, there was a point in my life when I thought I was going to become a volcanologist because I couldn't think of anything cooler than going and learning about volcanoes and going near them until my mom pointed out that I would be near heat, and I went, "Never mind." But I've been obsessed with volcanoes since I was a child. So somebody did a story set in the Pompeii world. And I was like, I am here for this. I love this. And then I got to the end and I'm like, wait a minute. Why would you end it like that? What do you mean? And it's like, and then it went from being like an original story to it kind of mirrored the ending of the Pompeii movie. And so I started thinking, hey, I could redo that and change it because of the character that I had in mind. I knew that it would have been a different story, and so there's a part of me that really does still wanna write that, and I'm still going to, Kat, at some point in my life, but it's looking at that story, and you're so upset by how it ended that you're like, "I need to redo this. I need to do a version of this that makes sense to me." Because we all have those books that we've read, and you're looking at it, and you get to the end, and you just kinda feel it wasn't resolved. Things weren't answered. There's still questions, or it didn't feel like it was a satisfactory ending. Well, that may be something that inspires you to write your own novel to fix that kind of a story. So that way you can write the story that you want.
I totally want to do that with Jane Austen's Persuasion, actually.
I mean, absolutely do it. That's what I did with Sense and Sensibility. I wanted to change that one element because Brandon did deserve better.
I need more Captain Wentworth being like a grumpy bitch, because it's very funny when he was.
But that's also partially why Jane
Or
Austen.
like Miss Marple and Mary Bennet. Mary Bennet was robbed of her glory.
But that's also why Jane Austen is such a rich ground for people to do adaptations and retellings now. Like, if you go in and you do a search for Jane Austen, a lot of the books that you're going to find are adaptations, or it's a continuation of like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's life after they got married. Then you'll have like death come.
Clueless.
Clueless is a perfect
Clueless
example.
is
It's an Emma adaptation.
yeah, Alicia Silverstone is, like, my favorite Emma.
Bridget Jones' Diary
Yeah.
is an adaptation of Jane Austen. It's an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice.
People should not be afraid to be inspired by other things and be inspired for 1,000 reasons. I know that oftentimes, like, I'll get ideas while reading a different book that might have nothing to do with the book that I'm reading at all. It might just be something comes into my head and I'm like, "Oh, I really wanna take this and play with this." And so for me, I again make sure that I have something that I can write with pretty much everywhere I go so that I can write down that idea as fast as it comes to me.
This is a good segue, I think, to what we wanted to talk about next, because once we have those ideas, how do we create our stories? Because you and I have very, very different ways of approaching our writing.
We sure do. So this is the place that you'd think writers would have tribal wars about these two different ways of writing, but the good news is the writing community likes both, and that is plotting versus pantsing.
You'll also hear pantsing called discovery writers for people who want to be a little
Yeah.
bit, make it sounds a little bit better, but yeah, no, we're flying by the seat of our pants. Let's be honest.
So, some of the famous people, when you're looking at sort of in fantasy, um, A really perfect canonical example of a plotter is J.R.R. Tolkien. That man wrote down, he had a map, he knew the journey, he knew how long everything was going to take, he developed languages, he knew exactly what was going to happen beat for beat. And on the pantser side, is actually George R.R. Martin has come out and said that he writes by the seat of his pants. He has sort of a general idea of where he's going to go with his story, but he just sort of like lets the story come out when he's actually sitting down and typing prose to page.
Another one that people don't really think about when they think about who a pantser is Stephen King.
Basically, what we're saying is that there are incredibly successful and wonderful stories in both plotting and pantsing. And so it's a your mileage may vary, and you get to sit down and figure out what fits best for you.
So now Kat and I are going to tell you about our two different ways of figuring out what we're doing with our stories, because in case you haven't figured out by listening to us, she is very much the plotter, and I am very much the fly by my seat of my pants pantser.
Yep, yep, yep.
So usually and this is me usually then going to Kat and being like, I need help figuring this out because I have a very weird way of developing my stories. I've tried outlining. I promise I have. I have created very detailed outlines. And by chapter 2, my characters have gone left instead of right and are laughing at me as I scramble to try and catch up with them. Because for me, I've done some stories that have very detailed, this is what needs to happen in these chapters to be able to create the entire story. And I felt myself feeling hemmed in by it because it didn't allow for a lot of creativity. And this was a lot of assignments that I had in high school and in college in my writing courses where they were saying, here's your story, here's what needs to happen in these chapters. I'm like, but I want to do that instead. And they go, you can't do that. I'm like, fine. So what I tend to do is I may sit down and start writing, and I've got a specific idea in my head. I want to write a story where, like, say it's a short story. I want to write a story where somebody adopts a cat and brings it home to his wife to try and cheer her up because she had lost her cat about a year before. That is not at all what I wound up writing because I sit down with a blank page in front of me and a blank little cursor blinking at me, taunting me, and I just start writing whatever comes to my mind. And then if it's a full novel, I'll go about like 2, 3 chapters in, and then I'll look at it and go, okay, cool. This is what I have so far. Let me figure out the general idea of where I want this to go. Just so I know, like, what are the major plot points that I will need to touch on eventually. Understanding that they are going to change as I continue to write. Because this is the entire thing with the discovery writer or the pantser writer is it's coming to us as we're writing. And so it's not something where if you're like I'm writing a story right now and I'm working on my next novel and it's an attorney romance. And I actually did outline the entire thing. I had it all set out. I was even trying to follow you'll hear a lot of people talk about a save the cat method, which is a way of creating a story so that way it has a flow or an arc of like when certain beats are supposed to happen. So I plotted out the entire story and was trying to follow it. And somewhere around chapter 7, all of a sudden, there's a brother that I didn't plan on being in the story. And then suddenly it went from just being the brother to it was a half brother. And then there was the mother and the father, and then the ex wife. And now all of a sudden there's a gala, and we're off to the races. Okay, we're just going to follow this. And then it wound up creating and having to change where I had gone with my outline because the things that I had put in the outline were no longer there. So I had to scramble to create a new outline. And this is the danger for a pantser when you're trying to create those outlines. Unless it's something that's very fluid, it's going to change. It's going to change often.
One of the big pros of discovery writing or pantsing though is it allows for enough freedom that a narrative can take a direction that no one would have ever seen coming. It's sort of like, instead of following the exact path on a map, seeing some like, sign for, a scenic byway that you were not expecting on your road trip and actually going, yeah, I'm going to turn right and I'm going to go on that scenic byway and let's see what's on that scenic byway.
You know, I had never thought about it like that. But that entirely explains my mindset. And I think that also comes because my family used to go road tripping during the summer months. And that's what they always did. It was never a direct, we're taking this path. It was, let's go to this antique place. Let's go to this little place. Let's go to this little chocolate shop. We were always discovering everything.
Yeah, it makes it so that it's probably gonna take a lot longer to get to the destination, and
But we had a lot more fun.
yeah, the worry with pantsing is if you don't have a destination in mind, you can noodle for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words just
Yes.
trying to find where that destination is and land the plane.
This is why I have a story that I'm only 2/3 of the way through, and I currently have 130,000 words into that story.
Yeah, it happens. But again, when you find that destination, you probably have written some things that, for instance, a very strict plotter is not going to have done because you were there letting the characters breathe a little bit.
Yes.
So Hayao Miyazaki, who has done an incredible number of the Studio Ghibli films, including Spirited Away, has this scene in Spirited Away where, Chihiro is just sitting quietly on a train, kind of gliding off to go see if she can find a way to save Haku. And she's heading off, and it's just quiet with this beautiful, like, reflective water, and it's got music. And Hayao Miyazaki sat down and he calls that concept ma, which is that it's a place in the narrative where not a lot is happening, but it's letting the viewer or the person experiencing it breathe a little bit. And so my guess is, pantsing writing actually allows for more places where you have concepts of ma that can come into the writing so that you're not, running, like crashing beat for beat for beat for beat for beat and making the reader almost exhausted, right, reading your story. You're having a moment where your heroine stops and sees this really cool gallery that she wants to go into and walks in, and it's nice, and she's having a cup of tea, and she just sits and stares at a painting for a while, and that painting, you know, gives her feelings, and it gives the reader a chance just to sort of exist with her.
And it also in some ways gives you the opportunity if you're a pantser writer. It's like with my most recent book, one of the things that everybody has sat there and said that they really appreciated was the way that I developed one of the characters and the growth that you saw from him as the story went. Because as I was writing the story, I was able to I saw how I was having him move and I saw how I was having him change and I wrote that into the story. Because you can read other novels and you're at the end of the book, you're like, did anybody really change? Did anybody really learn
Is
anything?
that your MMA fighter one, Ruby?
That is my MMA fighter one. That
Nice.
is challenging the heart, where it's you see the very big growth in Kane Mitchell, who's the main male character, from the beginning, where he's a hothead with a temper, to at the end, where he's become very methodical and calculated when he's like now in a fight and he's watching his opponent and he's adapting from the fighting. But it's also he's gone from shut off and not letting anybody near him to accepting that the people around him aren't just there because he's paying them, but because they actually like him. And he's accepted them as part of his support network. So you
I
see the change in the way the character interacts with people as the novel goes on.
Ironically, I think that it's actually the same with, the Chihiro moment in Spirited Away. You're sitting quietly with her where you see her go from being sort of scared to just determined. Like, it's a moment where you're like, "Wow, she has developed this sense of self and this sense of courage that's internal to her." And you just kinda see it in that moment because she's not wavering, she's not having action happen to her. She's just there in the moment, um, and you can see how determined she is. So again, for pantsing, that is actually one of the really important and cool things about doing stories that way is, for instance, you get more time to sit down and really get to know your characters and to let them sort of breathe.
Yeah.
So, plotting again is, I'm gonna say, like, we're talking as if we are 100% of one and 0% of the other. I think both of us have elements of both, plotting and pantsing, but I'm gonna say I actually can't start a story until I know how it ends. So I am very different in that if I have started writing chapter 1 and have prose on the page, I probably have already outlined the entire story. So I guess the good example for me is actually, the BBC radio inspiration that I had that I said sort of got to become a brainworm for me, is that I needed to sit down and I could not get it out of my head that there was such a great story there. And I basically sat down and I went, how can I make this story work? Well, I'm going to draw on the amazing inspiration I had gotten from reading Prince and the Pauper from Mark Twain, of all things, last year. And I'm basically going to take a radio DJ who hates the current regime and a pampered prince inside of a castle where he's completely naive to exactly how Daddy Dearest and, the religious advisor is treating the majority of people, and he sneaks a listen to this again pirate radio station. And I sat down and I went, okay, now I have the two main characters. I know what the premise is going to be. I need to create a plot for this. And I basically just sit down and I think about sort of the big beats that the story needs to probably take. You obviously need these two characters to meet each other. You need to have them come together and, probably start from a place of not understanding each other, to getting to a place where they understand each other and maybe they fall in love, because I am a fantasy writer who really likes writing her fantasy with some romance in it. And what happens when they have to overcome this suppressive regime, and where does that all come from, and how do I make that all happen? And I sit down and I bullet point and I bullet point and I bullet point, almost to the point that I have chapter by chapter decisions that are made for how things are going to play out. And it's always a lot of fun to do that, because at least for my mind, if I have not been able to do that, it doesn't feel good. I literally feel itchy until I know the ending. And then I start writing. What happens at the point that I start writing is a little bit more like Ruby than she probably realizes, which is, even though I have a guideline for my plot, I don't follow it exactly if the characters tell me they're not going to. What does that mean? It means that there are times that I will look at my plot, I will look at what my characters are doing, and I will go, because my characters are not doing the thing that I need them to do, which means I'm going to need to replot the rest of the story to fit what the characters are doing. So for me, it's kind of mostly plotting with a little bit of pantsing. So I do actually have some of the same ability to give my characters chances to breathe and to experience Ma. But often in my case, it's a little bit different because of the fact that if I don't know what's coming next, I have a very, very hard time continuing to write. And that's probably just because that's the way my brain works.
And I think I'm kind of a hybrid too, because Kat is very well aware of once I have my first 3 chapters, I usually come to her whiny because I don't know where to go. And she will sit and help me figure out what the general overview of the story is. So like I have um she's helping me plot out, I guess now this would be my 5th novel, really. Wow. Where I'm looking to try and create a Bratva story, which is the Russian mafia. And it was more of a I was, like, concerned or trying to figure out what my overall plot of my story was going to be, or the general idea of what my plot with story was going to be. So when I start writing, sometimes I'll do the first 3 chapters and then try to figure out, "Okay, where do I go from here?" Other times, I'll try to have an idea of what I want the overall plot to do, because that's really going to tell me, am I writing in first person? Am I writing in third person? What's the emotion of the story? Like, what's the way that the character is going to be acting? How are they going to interact with each other? And she can tell you, it's been taking me like 2 weeks to actually figure out where I really want to go, because I've literally started the story 3 times. Get into about
So
3 chapters and then restart it again.
yeah. And again, once I get the like you do the first 3 chapters a few times, I do the plot outline a few times, and we do them kind of in different places. So I think if you're sitting down and, for instance, you have a good idea, you love tropes, you walked along the beach and you saw a really cute dog frolicking in the water and trying to pull his person into the water with him, because dogs are good boys. And you have an idea for a story for that. Um, Asking yourself sort of questions based on sort of like, what are the stakes? What can this world be? Where do I need to go? is is often really, really useful. I can't even like, Ruby, I can't even describe, like, how I do it. I don't know what kind of probing questions I ask you. I just sort of, like, ask you places that I'm curious about stuff that usually helps figure out where the story needs to go, but it's just weird stuff my brain does.
Well, usually, like, if you're helping me with the plot, it's what's like the goal of my characters? How do they interact? What is it really? What am I really trying to get? Because you're usually trying to help me because I like the stories where there's some external force at the party that the main characters are having to deal with or overcome. And that's not something that's always that scene, but it's the kind of stories that I grew up on, so they're the kind of stories that I like. So you really do help me try to figure out like, okay, what's my antagonist motivation? What is my antagonist trying to do? How does that interact the characters? And then you've also helped me figure out like bring in things like because it's the Russian mafia, bring in ice and now make it very relevant and very modern to what's going on in 2025 and 2026. So you're usually helping me flush things out.
Yeah, that was easy inspiration.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, 2025.
It's not good.
Ugh.
I'd like to say 2026 is getting better, but unfortunately, we're on day
No.
4 and it's already gonna be a long year.
Yeah, it is. So, there are a lot of different ways people ask those questions of themselves to figure out where they want a story to go, and you have to figure out what your best way you have to figure out what works best for you. I actually find that I don't do a very good job following Save the Cat or following the hero's journey, etcetera, because trying to plug whatever my brain is doing into something that is a formula like that often is very, very hard for me. And that's, again, just sort of a personal, hurdle for me in my writing. So, for instance, if you really love world building, um, that's awesome. And one of the things that you can think about as you're building the world is what society are you going to put in the world? What problem are you going to give your protagonist that they need to overcome? And you can look at sort of the beats that Save the Cat give you, or the motivation that you get in the hero's journey to figure out what kind of story that you want to tell. You also can figure out where you wanna put your conflict. Do you wanna put your conflict internal? Do you wanna put, like, your conflict, is it, man versus the world, man versus himself, etcetera? And again, that can come down to what you enjoy. So, I think one of the places that you should be doing a lot, like, you should be thinking about doing your own inspiration, is make sure you're reading. Make sure you're reading and you're consuming, stories so that you see the things that you really like and the things maybe you don't. Um, I have a particular set of things that I really love in stories, and it means that when I write, it's often going to be a case that the things that I really love reading in other people's stories, I'm probably going to have as elements in my own stories. Because again, that is the thing that I'm writing because I'm enjoying myself. So keeping an eye on sort of places that you're really, enjoying what you're doing versus the places you're like, oh no, this does not work for me, is a really helpful way to decide when you've been inspired by, your brainworm and you wanna sit down and you wanna actually do something about it. You can ask yourself, "What is gonna be the what is gonna be the way that I do this that I most enjoy, the writing and the work that I'm doing?" For me, it's I like having a really deep connection with my characters, and I like making sure my characters have a really deep connection with each other, and oftentimes, I like building that in my stories. So when I'm writing, what you will probably see is the plots that I gravitate towards for my own writing tend to be plots where people start out pretty distant from each other and slowly but surely they get closer together until they're inseparable. For you, Ruby, for you, what is your what would you say if you're thinking about what you love to write? What are sort of the plot beats you often hit in your own writing?
I tend to write a lot about characters that are undergoing some emotional growth. And largely, I guess, like a lot of my heroes tend to be very closed off or very most people would probably call them antisocial, but I'd actually say that they're more guarded than anything. And that's largely because I tend to write characters that are a lot like myself. where it's like they didn't have an easy childhood, they didn't get along with people, and so they face a lot of adversity and conflict, and so that made them very wary or distrustful. Now, if you ask my husband, he would sit there and say that when he met me, I was the most outgoing and eager to please person he'd ever met, but he didn't realize at the time that it was a mask. That was just the persona I put out. So I tend to write people who wear masks a lot and may not be quite sure about who they are, but through the course of the book, they start to learn and they start to develop their own sense of self and they come into their own by the end of it. So I kind of like seeing the stories that have that growth. And usually there is some external factor that is forcing them to change, whether that's like in the MMA book that's out. It's a competitor that was trying to exploit him and get his entire career tanked. In my first book, Hearts on the Line, it's an ex-boyfriend that was now stalking the female main character. And then you also see his starting to kind of decline into a mental illness throughout the course of the book as she's gaining her strength and learning to stand on her own 2 feet after kind of being broken down by this guy. So I tend to write the big journey of somebody finding who they are, learning who they are, and stepping into who they want to be. Because those are the stories that I'm drawn to.
It's really important to know and to reassure everybody that pretty much every story has a reader. So don't let yourself get tripped up. If you are writing a story you love, don't let yourself get tripped up of, well, what if somebody else doesn't like this? Um, Guaranteed, there are going to be people who hate your book. It does not matter what your book is. It does not matter. There is no such thing as a perfect book. So find an inspiration that sparks joy and then write what you like, because that is going to be the writing that you are going to most enjoy doing and the writing that is going to be the most beneficial and probably going to bring the readers who want to read your book the most joy. Every book has a reader. So when you're thinking about how you're going to cultivate your inspiration, what you are drawn to in your story, know that you don't have to worry about you should not be thinking about whether or not a specific demographic of people are going to love it or not. Hopefully that's not why you're writing. And writing is hard enough that trying to write to market is probably going to make the journey and the joy of writing a lot less for you. And writing is the kind of thing you should be doing because you enjoy the journey and you enjoy the fact that your muscles are straining on the hike to get to the destination instead of just going to the destination. If you don't care and you just want a story where your two favorite characters get together in a very specific way, fine. I go like then what are you doing? Why are you writing?
And it's also right now, if you think about it, if you're trying to write to market and you're trying to go the traditionally published route, which is the getting the agent, going through the editor, getting it to a publisher, they do a new round of editing, they do a new round of graphics creation, and then the book is finally released. You're talking, it could be 3 to 4 years after you've written that book before it's been published. If you're writing to market now, that may not be what the market's looking for in 4 years.
Yeah. Basically, my advice would be don't try to write to market. Write in a way that Marie Kondo would say sparks joy. Because that is definitely what Ruby and I do. We find a weird idea, we grab onto it, and then we carry it to where we want it to go. In my case, writing an outline and then probably pretty fast having my characters tell me my outline was bunk and I have to do it again.
Versus me, where I will start off and start creating the characters and start writing the characters, and then try to create a general, here's the major points that I want to get to, and we'll see if we actually get to those.
So there you have it. The Too Long Didn't Read. There are an infinite number of ideas. There are so many different cool ways to be inspired. And what matters is not the shape of the seed, it's what you do to make sure that that garden grows.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in again. And we hope that this has been useful information and that it's helpful for you as well, because there are so many different ways to get inspiration. There are so many different ways to create your story. And then, as we were talking about, there's different ways of actually developing the plot of your story. Are you somebody who's going to be very methodical and very organized and have everything outlined out? Or following a 7 arc or a 5 arc or the save the cat format of the various plot points that have to be hit, or are you somebody who's going to be discovering it as you go? There's no wrong way to write a story. It's all your story, your path, what works for you. If I try to write where I'm forced into an outline, I will walk away and go to another story and just start creating on my own, because I feel like I can't. That's too much. As an attorney, I live by structure. Creative writing, that's too much structure for me when I'm writing.
Yep.
But if Kat were to try and follow my method, she probably runs screaming.
It doesn't work for me.
Because Lord knows I go screaming often enough.
So, this has been The Writing Affliction with Kat and Katze. Again, I am Catherine Thornwood, who you can find at catherinethornwood.com.
And I am R. Katz, and you can find me at rkatzbooks.com.